All right, everyone, welcome back to part 3 of your overthinking chords. I'm Friedemann Findeisen, this is Holistic Songwriting, and you're in the right place if you're a songwriter. So let's talk about overthinking chords. As I said in the previous 2 parts of this video, and you haven't seen those, please check those out. I think we are all overthinking chords way too much. Chords are really simple. You don't need to know about sub-5s or secondary dominants or all that crap if you want to write commercial, simple pop songs. It's all too much, and I'm trying to simplify and streamline the process. The only reason I've made 3 parts of this whole video series is because I'm trying to go really in depth so you can really understand every bit of the whole process, because it's really not complicated. So after you've gone through this series, there's nothing else you really need to know about chords if you just want to write simple songs. 90% of the songs or more are just going to be what I'm telling you. So today we're going to talk about a really interesting and important subject, which I don't hear quite enough of in the songs that I'm being sent in my weekly live streams, for example, and that's voice leading.
Before we get to that though, if you want the simplest solution for writing chord progressions, there is a plugin called Captain Chords that helps you pick the chords you want in the correct key. It'll help you come up with interesting rhythms, and it'll even take care of the voice leading for you. When you've got something you like, just drag it on a MIDI track and you're done. There's a sponsor for this video, so if this sounds good to you, check out the link in the description and use the coupon HOLISTIC to get a 10% discount. Anyways, back to the video.
So voice leading, what does that really mean? Well, when you're playing a chord, typically you have 3 notes that are going on at the same time, yeah? Sometimes 4, maybe 4, 5, but whatever. You have a certain amount of notes that are playing at the same time. Each of those notes we call a voice, and that's typically because we started, some of the first songwriters were people who wrote for choir, and then it was actually proper voices, right? And back then, what you wanted to do for these voices is you didn't want them to have to jump to really out their notes. You wanted each melody, each individual voice to have a logical progression, a logical melody that they could sing very easily. So it's easier to sing a melody that goes ba da da than singing ba 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 ba. You know what I mean? So if you're writing for choir, that was common practice to make sure that each voice was moving stepwise and not jumping to really, out their notes all of a sudden. And that's really what voice leading still is today. So here's a couple of things that you should keep in mind when you're writing chords pertaining to voice leading. Number 1 would be the bass does not need to do voice leading. Most often it is best if the bass part of your arrangement, so a bass guitar, or if you're playing just on piano, the left hand, just jumps around. So don't try to make that too melodic. Don't try to move that stepwise. That the bass really can move around a lot. And I've sang in 4-part vocal choirs, and I've sang the bass, and very often I had to jump around a lot, and the bass is typically the hardest part to sing out of. I did like a jazz quartet, and it was really quite challenging stuff. And that's because as a bass, you have to jump around way more than the other parts of the choir. So number 1, the bass doesn't do voice leading. And what you're seeing here will be a logical progression for any bass. Number 2 is stick to the same number of notes in your chords. So if your first chords starts off with 5 notes, then you want your second chord to have 5 notes as well. It sounds a little bit odd if the first chord in a chord progression is this full, rich chord, and the second chord is just like a power chord, it's 2 notes, and then the third chord is like 6 notes, and the fourth is 4. And I understand where that comes from, because in our modern days, when music production is really just you moving boxes on a screen and you can just copy paste and just move a box somewhere else, it's really easy until you're like happy with the chord, you move to the next one. But really, music theory and proper arrangement dictates that we want to have the same amount of notes per chord so we can have proper voice leading. So if this is something you're doing, if you're an electronic producer, for example, although I'll say something about that a little bit later as well, or you're a pop producer and you're mainly working in a DAW and just moving boxes around, I would suggest work a little bit more, think a little bit more about this. Try to have the same amount of notes per chord. Next would be moving notes stepwise and minimizing jumps. Okay, so I'll show you an example here first of a chord progression that is moving from this configuration we talked about. This is the root position, from a C major to an F major without proper voice leading. So it's using the same configuration for both of those chords, and that leads to a big jump between all of those notes, right? I'll play that for you so you can imagine what that sounds like. So first is C major, and second is F major. And that doesn't sound very good together. It sounds a little bit disconnected. It doesn't feel like it's part of the same song. That doesn't sound really good, right? So what we want to do ideally is we want to make sure that these voices, the three notes, so in C major that would be a C, E, and G, move stepwise, not jump. Okay, so here's what that would look like. In this case, we have a 1, 3, 5 for the first chord. That's again in root position. And for the second chord, we're using something that's called the second inversion. It's again, and the intervals here are 1, 4, 6. Okay, so basically what we did is we still have that same chord that you saw in the first example, the 1, 3, 5. We just moved that C, that the highest note in that chord, we moved that down an octave. Because functionally it doesn't matter where you place those notes. You can place them anywhere in any octave you want, as long as it's the same note. And that way, we have a chord progression that sounds a lot more logical. Let me play that for you. So this is C, E, G. And then this was the same in root position in F. Very disconnected. But if you play this way, also ergonomically as a piano player, it's much easier for me to play it this way because I just have to move two fingers. The C, the first finger, stays the same. And just these two fingers you have to move. See that? And that is great for your players because they can focus on performing, they can focus on putting emotion into the music rather than having to think about how ergonomically to make their fingers do all the things you want them to do, right? So clean voice leading helps your performers a lot. Now, if you have a bass, and in most music you will, that bass is typically very detached from everything else that's going on. So I'm going to show you like what that typically might look like on the piano. So if we have a chord progression that goes C, F, this is what it might look like on the piano. The right hand is playing the chord with proper voice leading, and the left hand does those jumps. See that? And the bass is very detached from the rest of the notes. One more thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about voicings is you want to space the notes pretty much evenly apart from one another. So you don't want to have like a small interval for the first two notes, and then the third note is like way up here. You don't want that. That happens a lot for people who drag boxes around their computer as well. You kind of want to keep the distances between the individual notes in your right hand, so for the chord, equal, about the same. They shouldn't be too far apart from one another, right? So just make sure that visually you kind of get what you're seeing here. A bass that can be removed, that can be way lower than everything else, and then the chords kind of stay in the same realm, right? So just make sure that you don't have two notes very close together and one that's very far away. It creates a sound that doesn't really work for most people. One more piece of advice for you music producers out there, and that is a lot of music producers, even the very successful ones commercially, don't really know music theory, and they don't know about what we just talked about today. They don't know about voice leading. And so what you'll hear in a lot of commercial productions these days that are very commercially successful, you will hear just chords in root position that are just jumping around the board like crazy. And it has become almost an element, a part of that genre. It's become a part of that sound. So if that's what you want, feel free to keep jumping around with your chords. That might just be part of what your genre is. It's part of that. So I'm not saying you have to voice lead in every genre. For most live bands, everything that you want to have a live feel, definitely stick to voice leading. On guitar, for example, it's another deal as well. Like power chords, we move those around like that. We don't really think about so that they stay in the same position. We don't really change the configuration as I showed you. We don't use different inversions for power chords, for example, or for bar chords even. Usually on guitar, we just slide things around, so there we don't have proper voice leading as well. But for anything on piano, for choirs, for pads, anything like that, you really want to stick to voice leading because that's just going to give you a more pleasurable listening experience. So one more time before we end this video, the most important thing to me is that you start listening to what you're writing. That's the most important lesson I can give you, okay? Please do not forget that. Use your ears, not what's between them. Don't try to overcomplicate things. Don't try to theorize or try to figure out like mathematically how things work. The core element of songwriting, the core principle to success is just listening to what you're writing, okay? If it feels right, if your ears are telling you that sounds awesome, I don't care what you're doing harmonically, right? If it works, it works. And that's it for our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in more, please like, share, and subscribe. And also head on over to Patreon, where you can ask me questions in a weekly live stream or send me songs to get my feedback. There's also a bunch of courses that you can also find in the description, so go check that out. Thank you so much for watching. Take care and stay gefährlich.